I need you to think about something before this story begins. Think about what you did this morning, what time you woke up, whether you made coffee or skipped it, what you wore, whether you drove somewhere, walked somewhere, stopped somewhere on the way. Think about who saw you. Think about whether you could prove, right now, today, if someone asked, exactly where you were and what you were doing at 7:43 p.m. on a specific evening 3 years ago. You probably cannot. Most of us cannot. We move through our lives leaving soft impressions rather than hard records. We are seen by people who will not remember us, photographed by cameras that overwrite their footage, documented only when something makes someone think documentation might matter. We exist in the world with the casual confidence of people who have never been asked to prove it. And most of the time, this is fine. Most of the time, nobody needs to know where you were at 7:43 p.m. 3 years ago. Your life proceeds. Your freedom proceeds. You wake up in the morning in your own bed, and you make your choices, and you go where you want to go. But sometimes they do need to know. Sometimes everything depends on it. Sometimes a jury of 12 people sits in a small room and decides, based on the available impressions and incomplete records and the specific fallible memories of human witnesses, that they know where you were and what you were doing. And sometimes they decide wrongly. And the wrongness does not announce itself. The wrongness arrives in an ordinary voice, reading words off a paper, and the world does not stop turning, and the floor does not give way beneath you, and there is no alarm that sounds to indicate that a catastrophic error has just occurred. There is just the verdict, and then the handcuffs, and then the cell. Marcus Webb was 29 years old when a jury decided it knew where he was on the night of October 11th, 2002. He was at home, he said, alone. He had been cooking dinner and watching a basketball game and had not left his apartment that evening. He had no one who could confirm this. No receipt from a delivery order, no phone call logged at the right time, no neighbor who had seen him in the hallway. Nothing that in the ordinary flow of an ordinary evening he had thought to document, because why would you document an ordinary evening? The prosecution said he had not been home. The prosecution said he had been 4 miles away, in the parking lot of a grocery store in Greenfield, Ohio, where a violent assault had taken place that left a man named Gerald Porter with a broken jaw, a fractured eye socket, and injuries that would require 4 surgeries to address. 2 witnesses had identified Marcus as the person they saw in that parking lot. One of them, a 38-year-old woman named Susan Holt, said she had looked directly at the attacker for approximately 15 seconds under the parking lot lights, and that the man she saw was Marcus Webb. She had no doubt, she said. None at all. Marcus Webb was convicted of aggravated assault in March 2003. He was sentenced to 20 years in the Ohio State Correctional System. He was innocent. He maintained his innocence for 20 years from inside a cell. Not loudly, not with the performed desperation of someone manufacturing a narrative, but steadily, consistently, with the specific and exhausting patience of someone who knows the truth and understands that the truth, in the context of a prison cell, is not automatically sufficient to set you free. He filed appeals that were denied. He requested case reviews that were tabled. He wrote letters that were answered with form responses. He waited. He kept knowing what he knew. And 20 years after his conviction, a detail emerged. A tiny detail. Something so small that the attorney who first identified it told a colleague afterward that she had almost skipped past it. Something that had been in the evidence file for 2 decades without anyone understanding what it meant. Something that had been there the entire time, waiting for someone to look at it the right way. That detail changed everything. Stay with me, because this story is not just about one man's wrongful conviction. It is about what the justice system looks like from the inside of a cage you did not deserve to be in. It is about the people who fight for the wrongfully convicted and the extraordinary rarity of the cases that actually break open. It is about a tiny detail and 20 years and a man who did not stop telling the truth, even when the truth was not enough to free him. And it is about the morning he walked out of a correctional facility in Ohio and stood in a parking lot and looked at the sky and breathed air that was, for the first time in 20 years, entirely his. Marcus Webb grew up in Greenfield, Ohio, a mid-sized Midwestern town with the specific character of places that have been shaped by 1 or 2 dominant industries and carry, in their architecture and their rhythms, the imprint of those industries long after they have changed or declined. His father, James Webb, had worked at the paper mill for 31 years.
His mother, Dorothy Webb, had worked as a home health aide, a job she had held with the particular dedication of someone who had chosen work that mattered rather than work that paid well, and who had made the choice consciously and without regret. Marcus was the middle of 3 children. His older sister Vivian was 3 years ahead of him in school, and had from childhood possessed the quality of someone who makes everything look manageable, organized, steady, the kind of person who arrived places early and remembered birthdays, and upon whom the rest of the family quietly depended in ways that were not always acknowledged but were always felt. His younger brother Kevin was 6 years behind him, gap large enough that Marcus had sometimes felt more like a third parent than a sibling, a role he had accepted with a mix of pride and mild annoyance that had mellowed by the time he was in his 20s into simple love.
He graduated from Greenfield Regional High School in 1991. He had not been a spectacular student, adequate in math, interested in history, genuinely talented in a mechanical drawing class that his teacher had described as producing work that suggested spatial intelligence well above average. He had gone to work after graduation rather than college, doing construction labor initially and then, through a connection his father had established, learning plumbing as a trade. By the time he was 25, he had his journeyman's license. By 29, he was working steadily, had his own apartment on the east side of Greenfield, and was, by the accounts of everyone who knew him, a person whose life was moving in the right direction. He had a girlfriend named Angela Price, who he had been seeing for 2 years. He had friends from his construction days and from the neighborhood he had grown up in. He had no criminal record, not an arrest, not a parking ticket, not a single interaction with law enforcement beyond a brief conversation at a traffic stop 6 years earlier that had resulted in a warning about a broken taillight. He was, in every documentable way, a person with no particular reason to be in a parking lot assaulting a stranger on an October evening. He also had no alibi for where he had been that evening. And in a criminal trial, the absence of an alibi is a silence that a prosecutor can fill with alternative narrative. And once the alternative narrative is filled, the burden of dislodging it falls on the defendant in a way that the law technically says it should not, but that the psychology of a jury often means it does. Marcus Webb was convicted on March 14, 2003, by a jury that deliberated for 6 hours. The foreman read the verdict in a voice that Marcus has described as entirely ordinary, not dramatic, not satisfied, just reading words off a paper the way you'd read a grocery list. Marcus has said that the ordinariness of it was the most disorienting part, that he had expected the wrongness of it to be somehow visible in the moment, that a false verdict would arrive differently than a true one. It did not. He was handcuffed. He was walked out of the courtroom. In the hallway, he saw his mother Dorothy's face for a moment before he was moved past her. He has said that Dorothy's face is what he thought about most in the months that followed. Not the verdict, not the sentence, not the cell. His mother's face in the hallway. The specific expression of a person absorbing something that their mind will not stop trying to reject. He went to prison that same afternoon. He was 29 years old.
To understand how Marcus Webb was convicted of something he did not do, you have to understand the specific architecture of the evidence against him. Not because the architecture was unusual, it was not, but because understanding it is how you understand both why the conviction happened and why the detail that eventually unraveled it was so important. The case rested on 3 things. The first was the eyewitness identification of Susan Holt. She was 38 years old. She had been leaving the grocery store when she heard a disturbance in the parking lot and turned to look. She had seen a man striking another man. She had looked, she said, for approximately 15 seconds before the attacker ran. She had described the attacker to police as a black man, approximately 6 feet tall, wearing dark clothing, with a heavy build. A description that the prosecution would argue at trial matched Marcus Webb. At a police lineup conducted 5 weeks after the incident, Susan Holt identified Marcus Webb as the attacker. She had been certain, she said, no hesitation. There is now extensive research that did not exist in the form it currently exists in 2002 when Marcus was tried, but that has accumulated in the 2 decades since, about the reliability of eyewitness identification, particularly across racial lines, particularly under the stress of witnessing a violent event, particularly from a distance and under artificial lighting. The research is unambiguous. Eyewitness identification is significantly less reliable than juries believe it to be, and the confidence with which a witness reports their identification has essentially no correlation with its accuracy. A witness who says she had no doubt is not more likely to be correct than a witness who says she is not entirely sure. The certainty is a feeling, not a measurement. In 2002, this research was not routinely presented to juries. Susan Holt's certainty was simply her certainty, reported as such, received as such. The second element was a second witness,
a man named Barry Sims who had been in the parking lot that evening and who told police he had seen a man matching Marcus's description getting into a car he identified as similar to Marcus's car, a dark blue sedan, and driving toward the parking lot entrance approximately 15 minutes before the assault. Barry Sims had not seen the assault itself. He had seen a man and a car. The third element was Marcus's absence of alibi. He had been home alone. There was no one to confirm this and nothing to document it. Against these three elements, Marcus's defense, provided by an overworked public defender named Thomas Ellery, who was carrying 47 active cases at the time of the trial, and who had, by his own subsequent admission, inadequate time to prepare the Marcus Webb case with the thoroughness it required, had little to work with. Thomas Ellery was not incompetent, he was insufficiently resourced, which is a different problem and a far more common one. He challenged the eyewitness identification. He pointed out the limitations of Barry Sims' account. He argued that the absence of an alibi was not the same as evidence of presence. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and found Marcus guilty. Thomas Ellery filed an appeal the following month. It was denied. He filed a second appeal 18 months later, arguing newly identified procedural issues in the original trial. It was denied. Marcus filed subsequent appeals himself from prison, having taught himself the relevant procedural law through the prison library system. They were denied.
The architecture of his conviction held. It was held for 20 years. 20 years is not an abstract number. It is not a statistic. It is not a sentence read in a courtroom that means something for a moment and then becomes language. It is 7,300 mornings waking up in the same constrained space and understanding again, in the first seconds of consciousness before the day's armor goes on, where you are and why, and that it is wrong. It is the same number of evenings lying in the dark thinking about the day that is gone and the day that is coming, and the accumulating total of days that are gone and will not come back. It is the specific, grinding arithmetic of a life that has been taken and cannot be replaced while it is being taken, cannot be paused, cannot be stored, cannot be returned in any form that is equivalent to what it was before. Marcus Webb turned 30 in prison. He turned 35. He turned 40. The major landmarks of a man's adulthood, the things that mark the movement from one phase of life to the next, happened inside, not in the way they should have happened, in the diminished, institutional, stripped-down way that things happen in a place designed to contain rather than support the people in it. His father James died in 2008. Marcus was not there. He received the news in the way that prisoners receive the worst news, through a phone call from Vivian in a visiting room at a time that had been scheduled in advance, because even grief in that context is scheduled. He was allowed to attend the funeral under custody, handcuffed in a correctional vehicle with officers present. He has said about his father's funeral, "I was there and I wasn't there. I was at the service in a body that was monitored and restrained, and I watched my father's casket, and I thought about every conversation we had not had and every conversation we would not have, and the people around me were grieving freely, and I was not free to grieve in any way that felt like mine." He read. The prison library was limited, but he used it completely, working through legal texts as part of his ongoing self-representation efforts, reading history and biography, and eventually philosophy. He had not been a reader before prison. He became one out of necessity, because reading was one of the few activities available that took him somewhere other than the cell, the yard, the dining hall, and the grinding repetition of institutional time. He read about justice specifically, about its history and its failures and its theoretical foundations, with the focused attention of someone who is not reading abstractly, but is reading about something that is happening to them, and that they need to understand as completely as possible in order to survive it with their sense of self intact.
He worked. The prison had a workshop program for furniture repair and construction, which engaged his mechanical aptitude in a way that he found, he has said, necessary for the maintenance of his sanity. "I needed to make things," he told an interviewer. "I needed to build something that worked. When everything around you is wrong, when the system around you is producing a wrong outcome every single day and calling it justice, building something that works is how you remember that you still know how things are supposed to go. You put a joint together correctly, and it holds, and you know that you still understand what correctly means, that you haven't lost that the wrongness is external, not you." He maintained relationships. Dorothy came every month for the first 12 years until her health made the trip difficult. Vivian came after that, and Kevin, who had grown into an adult during Marcus's imprisonment, and who had a job and a family and a life that Marcus had watched from a distance through visiting room glass. Angela Price had ended the relationship in the first year. Marcus has said this without bitterness. She had a life to live. I understood that. I still understand it. I would not have wanted her to wait. I just hoped she was happy. He wrote letters to his family consistently, every week for 20 years, to legal advocacy organizations repeatedly over the course of years, dozens of letters to dozens of organizations, most of which were answered with form responses explaining that the organization's resources were limited and that they could not take every case, and that they wished him well. Each rejection was its own small loss. He has said he kept writing anyway because stopping felt like agreeing that the truth was not worth the effort of saying it. The truth was always there, he has said. I was going to keep saying it until someone heard it. I did not know how long that would take. I was going to keep saying it anyway. One of those letters, the one he sent to the Ohio Innocence Project in 2021, 18 years into his sentence, landed on the desk of a paralegal named Diana Flores, who read it on a Tuesday afternoon and flagged it for review. Diana Flores was 26 years old. She had been with the Innocence Project for 11 months. She would later say that she flagged the Webb letter not because anything in it was uniquely compelling. She received dozens of letters a week from people claiming wrongful conviction, and almost all of them required careful evaluation, but because something in the specificity of his account caught her attention. He was not emotional. He was not desperate. He described the sequence of events with the matter-of-fact precision of someone who has told the same true story so many times that the emotion has been worn away by repetition, and what remains is simply the facts, laid out clearly, in order, waiting for someone to look at them properly for the first time. She brought the letter to her supervising attorney, Rebecca Tanner. Rebecca Tanner put the Webb case on the review list. It would be 14 months before the review produced the detail that changed everything.
The Ohio Innocence Project was founded in 2003, the same year Marcus Webb was convicted, as part of the broader national network of innocence projects established in law schools across the country to investigate and litigate cases of potential wrongful conviction. The work is slow, underfunded, and emotionally demanding in the way of work that involves sitting with evidence of injustice without always being able to address it quickly enough. The attorneys and students and paralegals who do it are not doing it for career advancement. They are doing it because the alternative, knowing about this category of failure and doing nothing, is not something they can live with. Rebecca Tanner had been with the Ohio Innocence Project for 9 years when Diana Flores brought her the Webb letter. She was 37 years old, a former public defender who had moved to innocence work after a case in her 3rd year of criminal defense practice had produced a conviction she had never been able to fully accept as just. She had not been able to prove it wrong, but she had not been able to stop thinking about it either. The Innocence Project had given her a place to put that kind of thinking. She reviewed the Webb file over a period of 3 weeks. She read the trial transcript. She read the police investigation documents, the lineup procedure documentation, the medical records from the assault, the witness statements from Susan Holt and Barry Sims, the defense's filings, the appeal denials. And then she read the evidence inventory. The evidence inventory was a document produced at the time of the original investigation, listing every piece of physical evidence collected from the scene of the assault and during the subsequent investigation. It was 7 pages long and largely unremarkable. Standard items from a standard assault investigation: blood samples, clothing fibers, a partial shoe print, the victim's personal effects, a security camera tape from the grocery store's exterior camera. Rebecca stopped. She went back to the trial transcript and searched for any reference to security camera footage. She found a brief exchange between the prosecutor and an investigating detective, in which the detective confirmed that the security camera tape had been examined and found to contain no useful footage of the parking lot incident. No useful footage. The tape had been reviewed. It had been found wanting. It had been added to the evidence inventory and set aside. Rebecca Tanner noted this in her case summary. She made a note beside it. Then she moved on. She did not know yet what the note would eventually produce. She did not know that the phrase "no useful footage" was about to become the most important 5 words in Marcus Webb's case. She did not know that the security camera tape, sitting in an evidence storage facility for 20 years, still existed, that it had not been destroyed, that it had survived 2 facility consolidations and a records management overhaul, and the 2 decades of institutional neglect that consume most evidence not flagged for active use.
She did not know any of that yet. What she knew was that something in the file didn't sit right, and she had learned, over 9 years of this work, to trust that feeling. The detail that changed everything was a timestamp. Rebecca Tanner had requested the original security camera tape from evidence storage as part of the Innocence Project's standard review process for the Webb case. It had taken 8 weeks to locate the tape. It had been misfiled during the 2015 facility consolidation and was eventually found in a box labeled with a different case number, and another 3 weeks to have it transferred and digitized by a forensic video specialist. The specialist who conducted the digitization was Frank Morales, a 32-year veteran of forensic video analysis who had been an expert witness in more than 200 trials and whose professional reputation was, as Rebecca knew from prior work together, unimpeachable. He had reviewed the tape and provided a report. The report contained one finding of significance. The grocery store's exterior security camera had not, contrary to what the original investigating detective had stated at trial, captured no useful footage of the parking lot incident. It had captured footage of a portion of the parking lot, not the area where the assault occurred, which was at the far end of the lot beyond the camera's angle, but an area closer to the store entrance. And in that footage, at 7:43 p.m. on October 11, 2002, the time of the assault, as established by the victim's 911 call, a dark blue sedan was visible, parked near the store entrance. The sedan was in the footage for 11 minutes. It did not move. The assault occurred during those 11 minutes, and the license plate on the sedan, partially obscured by the angle but enhanced through digital processing, was not Marcus Webb's license plate. It was not Marcus's car. Barry Sims had testified that he had seen a man matching Marcus's description getting into a dark blue sedan and driving toward the parking lot entrance approximately 15 minutes before the assault. If that sedan was the one in the security footage, and the color, make, and approximate model year were consistent, then the car had been parked near the store entrance at the time of the assault. It had not left and returned to the parking lot. It had been there the whole time, and it belonged to someone else. Frank Morales' report ran 11 pages. Rebecca Tanner read it 3 times before she called Diana Flores into her office and asked her to close the door. She said, "We have something."
What happens after an Innocence Project finds potentially exculpatory evidence is not, as television suggests, a rapid and dramatic sequence of events culminating in an immediate release. It is a process, a painstaking, legally complex, jurisdictionally intricate process that moves at the speed of institutional bureaucracy and requires, at every stage, the cooperation of entities that did not convict the right person and are not always enthusiastic about demonstrating this publicly. Rebecca Tanner filed a motion for post-conviction relief in the Court of Original Jurisdiction in October 2022. The motion was 43 pages long and attached the Morales report, a declaration from Frank Morales, a legal analysis of the original investigation's treatment of the security footage, and a request for DNA testing of the physical evidence collected at the scene. The motion was assigned to Judge Patricia Howell, a 17-year veteran of the Ohio bench whose reputation among the attorneys who appeared in her courtroom was for rigorous procedural standards, and when those standards were satisfied, an unwillingness to let institutional inertia override the law. She read the motion herself rather than delegating the initial review to a clerk. This was unusual. It was also, Rebecca Tanner would say later, the thing that mattered most in the initial phase. Judge Howell granted the DNA testing request. She ordered the physical evidence from the original case, specifically blood samples and clothing fibers collected from the scene of the assault, to be submitted for modern DNA analysis. The DNA results, when they came back, were consistent with Gerald Porter, the victim. They were also consistent with an unknown male contributor, an individual whose DNA profile was not Marcus Webb's. The unknown contributor's profile was run through CODIS, the federal DNA database, and returned a match. The match was to a man named Raymond Cutler. Raymond Cutler was 54 years old. He had a prior assault conviction from 2005, 3 years after the incident in the Greenfield grocery store parking lot in a neighboring county. He had served 4 years and been released. He had not been a person of interest in the original Marcus Webb investigation because nobody had known to look for him. Nobody had known to look for him because the investigation had proceeded on the basis of Susan Holt's identification and Barry Sims' account and the absence of Marcus's alibi, and had not required any additional suspect. When Raymond Cutler's name appeared in the CODIS match, Rebecca Tanner and Diana Flores were in the office together. Diana has described the moment as, quote, "one of the quietest moments I have ever experienced in a loud building. We just looked at the result, and then we looked at each other. And neither of us said anything for a while because there isn't anything to say when you're looking at something like that. You just look at it and understand what it means." What it meant was that Marcus Webb had been in prison for 20 years for an assault committed by Raymond Cutler.
What it meant was that the security camera tape, reviewed in 2002 and described as containing no useful footage, set aside, stored in a misfiled box for 20 years, had contained the entire time a partial license plate that pointed away from Marcus Webb and toward someone else. What it meant was that the tiny detail had been there all along. The legal process that followed the CODIS match took 7 months, not because anyone in the process was acting in bad faith. The prosecutor's office cooperated, the original investigating agency cooperated, the court moved with reasonable speed, but because the law requires certain things to happen in certain ways, and the ways take time, and time is the one thing Marcus Webb had given enough of. Judge Howell presided over the post-conviction hearing in April 2023. The hearing lasted 2 days. Rebecca Tanner presented the forensic video analysis, the DNA results, the chain of documentation connecting Raymond Cutler's profile to the scene. An expert in eyewitness identification testified about the research that had accumulated since 2002 regarding the reliability of cross-racial identification under stress. Raymond Cutler, who had been located and interviewed, declined to testify but did not provide an alibi for the evening of October 11, 2002. The prosecutor's office, to their credit, did not oppose the motion for exoneration. The assistant prosecutor who handled the hearing, a young woman named Sarah Chen, who had not been involved in the original conviction, said in the closing statement of the hearing something that Rebecca Tanner has quoted publicly since. The system failed Marcus Webb. That failure was not the product of malice. It was the product of human fallibility and a process that we often ask to carry more certainty than human beings are capable of providing. We cannot give him back 20 years. We can give him this. Judge Howell granted the motion. She vacated the conviction of Marcus Webb on April 17, 2023. She said, from the bench, in the measured and careful language that judges use because the words they say in those moments have legal weight and also human weight, and both require precision, the court finds that the evidence now available, taken together, establishes by clear and convincing standard that Mr. Webb's conviction was based on identification evidence that was insufficient to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, and that the physical evidence is inconsistent with Mr. Webb's involvement in the offense. The conviction is vacated. The sentence is terminated. Mr. Webb is to be released forthwith. Marcus Webb was sitting at the defense table when she read those words. He has been asked many times what he felt in that moment. He gives the same answer every time. He says, "I felt the truth land. For the first time in 20 years, the truth landed somewhere that mattered." He walked out of the Harmon Correctional Facility on the morning of April 18, 2023, at 9:17 a.m. The parking lot was gray and cold, an Ohio April that had not yet committed to spring. There were people there. Vivian, who was now 52 years old and who had driven 4 hours and arrived at 6 a.m. to make sure she would not miss a single moment of this one. Kevin, who was 43 and who had his own daughters now, 2 girls, 7 and 10, who Dorothy had insisted stay home because she had said he should have family first, not an audience, and who Kevin had agreed with, and then had to explain to them why they were not coming, and had found the explanation very difficult. Rebecca Tanner and Diana Flores, who had driven down together, and were standing slightly to one side, because this moment was not theirs, and they knew it. And Dorothy, 81 years old, in a wheelchair now, because her knees had given up the fight 3 years earlier. Kevin had pushed her to the front. Marcus Webb walked through the door of the correctional facility and stopped in the parking lot and looked up at the sky. He has said that this was not a conscious decision, that he had not planned to stop and look at the sky, that his body simply stopped and his eyes simply went up, that the sky on that morning was the color of nothing in particular, and he stood in the parking lot looking at it for what he thinks was about 30 seconds and did not think about anything specific. "I just breathed," he has said. "I just breathed the air. It sounds like nothing. It was everything." Then he looked down and saw Dorothy. He has not spoken extensively about that moment. He has said only that he walked to her and that she put her hand on the side of his face the way she had done since he was small, and that he knelt down in front of the wheelchair in the parking lot and put his forehead against her hand and stayed there. Vivian has said, "He stayed like that for a long time. We all just waited. Nobody said anything. Nobody moved. It wasn't a moment that needed words." Dorothy passed away 14 months later, in June 2024. She had gotten in the end what she had spent 20 years praying for. Her son had come home. Marcus was with her.
Susan Holt was 60 years old when Marcus Webb was exonerated. She had been living in Greenfield for her entire adult life and had, in the 20 years since the trial,
thought about Marcus Webb with a frequency that she would describe in the conversation she eventually requested with the Innocence Project's victim advocate as something I lived alongside. She had not known she was wrong. This is important to understand. She had not lied. She had not constructed a false identification out of malice or indifference or racial animus, though the research on cross-racial eyewitness identifications suggests that unconscious bias is a factor in these cases, in ways that the identifier is often genuinely unaware of. She had seen a man committing a violent act under parking lot lights from approximately 40 feet away for approximately 15 seconds, and she had been asked to identify that man, and she had identified the man who was in the lineup and who looked to her like the man she had seen, and she had been certain. She had been certain because certainty is what 15 seconds of looking at something under stress produces in a human brain. Not accuracy, but the feeling of accuracy. The feeling is real. The accuracy is not guaranteed. She asked to speak to Marcus, not through attorneys, directly. She asked the victim advocate if this was something that could be arranged, and the victim advocate had asked Marcus, and Marcus had said yes. What they said to each other in that conversation is private. What Susan Holt has said publicly in a single statement released through the Innocence Project's communications office is this: I identified a man as someone I had seen commit a crime. I was certain. I was wrong. I do not know how to carry that. I am trying to learn. I am sorry to Marcus Webb in a way that words are not adequate for, and that I will spend the rest of my life trying to express through how I live and what I do. I am also telling this story publicly because I was a person who believed that when I was certain I was right. I was not right. I need other people to know that certainty is not the same as accuracy, that testimony given in good faith can still be false testimony, that the system should not rely on it as heavily as the system relies on it. I was wrong. I told the truth as I understood it, and I was wrong. These two things are both true. I have had to learn to hold both of them.
Raymond Cutler was charged with the 2002 assault of Gerald Porter in May 2023, 1 month after Marcus Webb's exoneration. The statute of limitations on assault in Ohio had not expired because the original charge had been filed within the limitation window, and Marcus Webb's conviction, which had been based on a wrongful identification of the actual perpetrator, did not constitute a prosecution of Cutler that would bar subsequent charges. He was 64 years old. He was arrested at his home in a neighboring county, where he had been living quietly, without distinction, in the years following his 2005 conviction for the separate assault. He had served his 4 years for that offense. He had been paroled. He had been living the photographically ordinary life of someone who had not, in the 20 years since 2002, attracted the specific kind of attention that would have connected him to what had happened in a Greenfield parking lot. His attorney entered a not guilty plea. The case was proceeding through the courts at the time of the most recent public reporting on the Webb exoneration. Gerald Porter, who was 61 years old, who had spent 4 years in physical therapy following the assault, who had followed the news of Marcus Webb's exoneration with the particular complexity of a person who is simultaneously a victim, an unwitting participant in an injustice, and a man still looking for resolution, gave a brief statement through his attorney. He said, "I was assaulted. The wrong man was convicted for what was done to me. I spent 20 years believing that the right person was in prison. I want the right person to face what he did. I want Marcus Webb to know that I never wanted what happened to him. And I want my own story to finally have a true ending."
Marcus Webb is 50 years old. He has been out of prison for just over a year as of the most recent reporting. He has been compensated through Ohio's wrongful conviction compensation statute, a payment that is, by any reasonable accounting, insufficient to represent 20 years of a life, and that Marcus has described as better than nothing, which is what I had before. He has moved into an apartment in Columbus, helped by Vivian, who spent the year of his exoneration preparing for his release with the same organized, steady competence she has brought to every challenge of her adult life. He has a space that is his own. He has, for the first time in 20 years, a door he can close from the inside. He has been learning things: how to use a smartphone, not just the basic functions, but the full range of capabilities that the device now has, which were not available when he last lived freely. How to use the internet for something other than legal research, which had been his primary use of library computers during his imprisonment. He has been, he says, surprised by how much has changed, and also by how much has not. He is working with the Ohio Innocence Project on a program for incarcerated individuals who believe they have been wrongly convicted, not as an attorney, because he is not an attorney,
but as a person who has navigated the process from the inside and understands what it requires and where the walls are. He visits correctional facilities. He sits with people who are where he was. He does not promise outcomes. He tells the truth about what the process requires and what it takes and how long it can take. He tells them to keep knowing what they know. He has been asked whether he is angry. He answers this question the same way every time, and the answer is not the answer most people expect. He says, "Anger is expensive. I spent 20 years in a situation that wanted to take everything from me. I am not going to give it my future too. I am not saying I feel nothing. I feel things that don't have names, things that come at unexpected times, that I am working through with the help of a therapist who is very good at sitting with complicated things. But anger as a permanent condition, as a way of orienting to the world, is not something I can afford. I have too much to do." He has been asked what the tiny detail means to him, the timestamp, the license plate, the 11-minute parking lot footage that had been reviewed in 2002 and set aside and misfiled and eventually found and digitized and enhanced to show what it had always shown.
He has been asked what the tiny detail means to him, the timestamp, the license plate, the 11-minute parking lot footage that had been reviewed in 2002 and set aside and misfiled and eventually found and digitized and enhanced to show what it had always shown. He says, "It means the truth was always there. It was always there. It just needed someone to look at it the right way. That is what I held on to for 20 years. Not hope exactly. Hope can break, but the knowledge that the truth existed, that it was somewhere, that it was waiting. That is what I held on to." This story is about a timestamp, but it is also about so much more than a timestamp. It is about the gap between certainty and accuracy, about the specific danger of a justice system that relies heavily on eyewitness testimony while simultaneously understanding, in the research, in the academic literature, in the mounting evidence of exoneration cases, that eyewitness testimony is among the least reliable forms of evidence available. Susan Holt was certain. She was wrong. These two things coexist in a way that the original trial could not accommodate, because the trial was not designed to accommodate them. It was designed to weigh the evidence as presented. The evidence as presented was insufficient to produce a just outcome. Marcus Webb spent 20 years in a cell. This story is about resources, about the difference between a defense mounted by a public defender carrying 47 cases and a defense mounted by a team with adequate time, adequate investigation capacity, and adequate funding. Thomas Ellery was not a bad attorney. He was a good attorney with not enough time. In a system where the quality of your defense is partly determined by your ability to pay for it, the quality of justice is also partly determined by your ability to pay for it. Marcus Webb could not pay for it. Marcus Webb paid instead with 20 years. This story is about what it takes to survive the experience of being right in a context that insists you are wrong, about the particular form of endurance required when the truth is not enough, about a man who woke up every day in a cell he should not have been in and chose every day to keep knowing what he knew, not because it changed anything, because it was true. And this story is about Diana Flores, 26 years old, reading a letter on a Tuesday afternoon and flagging it for review, about the accumulation of small attentions that eventually produces one large change, about all the people who work in the space between the verdict and the truth, in the institutions and organizations that exist specifically because the system is not infallible, and somebody has to be paying attention to the places where it fails. About Rebecca Tanner requesting evidence from storage and noting a phrase in a trial transcript, "no useful footage," about trusting the feeling that something didn't sit right. About Frank Morales digitizing a tape that had been misfiled for 7 years and finding a timestamp that had been there all along. About the truth sitting in a box in a storage facility, waiting for someone to look at it properly. The truth was always there. Marcus Webb always knew it was there. Now the rest of us know too. Let us pause right here for just a moment.
Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends, and if you are new here, welcome home. If this story is already sitting in your chest, if Marcus is already sitting with you, if Dorothy in the parking lot is already sitting with you, then you are exactly who this channel was built for. Hit subscribe right now, because tomorrow I am releasing another story just as powerful as this one, and you do not want to miss it. Every single day, new story, real people, real states, always worth your time. Drop your location in the comments below. Tell me where in the world you are watching from tonight.
I read every single one. Now, back to the story. Back to Marcus. Back to what happens when the truth is finally allowed to land where it belongs. If this story found you, if Marcus found you, if Dorothy found you, if the parking lot on an April morning found you, then you already know why this channel exists. We tell the stories that the headlines summarize in 2 sentences and move on from, the stories that require time and patience and the willingness to sit with something complicated. The stories about human beings who were inside a broken system and who held on to the truth anyway, and who, sometimes, not always, not often enough, but sometimes, get to watch the truth land somewhere that matters. If that kind of storytelling matters to you, subscribe right now, because next week there is another story waiting, and it is going to find you the same way this one did. Like this video for Marcus, for Dorothy, who came every month for 12 years and who got what she prayed for Vivian, who showed up at 6 a.m., for Diana Flores, who read a letter on a Tuesday afternoon, for Rebecca Tanner, who trusted the feeling that something didn't sit right. The algorithm responds to your liking. Make it respond to them. Share this video with the person in your life who needs to understand what wrongful conviction looks like from the inside, with the law student, with the person who has served on a jury and now has questions, with the person who has a loved one inside a system they believe failed them, and who needs to know that the Innocence Project exists and takes cases and can be contacted. Comment below. Tell me which moment stopped you. Tell me about the parking lot. Tell me about Susan Holt's statement. Tell me about what 20 years of holding on to the truth looks like to you. And if you know of a case, a wrongful conviction, an open injustice, a story that deserves this kind of attention, bring it to me. With names, with timestamps, with the tiny details that had been sitting in evidence boxes waiting for someone to look at them properly. All of it. Thank you for being here. Thank you for staying. Thank you for paying attention. If you believe you or someone you know has been wrongfully convicted, the Innocence Project can be contacted at innocenceproject.org. The Ohio Innocence Project can be reached at law.uc.edu/ohio-innocence-project. There are people trained to do exactly this work. The truth is sometimes waiting for someone to look at it the right way. Keep looking.